Hello, and welcome to this special episode. This video is a collaboration between my channel, Dining with Death, and the fabulous channel Under the Ash Tree. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Stacy Lee. On Tuesdays, I tell true crime stories in story form, and on Thursdays, I tell true crime stories that have an element of food to them. I'm a chef and restaurateur as well as a true crime buff, and I blend those two things together. So for example, on Thursday, we might talk about a mobster, and then I make the food from the restaurant he was killed in. Or I cover the crimes of someone on death row, and then I show you and taste their last meal before execution. I'm so excited to do this collaboration with Under the Ash Tree. It's a great channel. I've been watching it forever, and I'm honored. I'll let them introduce themselves to my viewers in their part of the video. This video is going to be split into two parts. This story seemed a natural fit for a collaboration because the story itself is in two parts. For many years, this case went unsolved. The killer emerges, authorities are able to link some of his victims together, and then as suddenly as he appears, he disappears, but he is not gone. He goes dormant for years and then begins killing again. Police thought maybe he had died. But then, after 13 years of silence, and much to the dismay of the people of California, he returned. I am going to take the first part of the story, covering a timeline of the first set of murders, the murders that took place in the 1980s. And then I'm going to turn the story over to Under the Ash Tree for the second half of the story. I'm so glad you're here, whether you're coming from my channel or from Under the Ash Tree. And I hope you enjoy this special episode. Let's get into it. 1985. We begin our story in Los Angeles. The crime rate was on a steady rise all throughout the 1980s, and the police force was overwhelmed by the booming growth taking place in the city. Each year, there were more robberies, more assaults, and more murders. When women began turning up dead in alleyways, sadly, it wasn't much of a shock or anything unusual in 1980s Los Angeles. But before long, it became very apparent to police that some of these murders were far from usual. The 80s began with double-digit inflation and rising unemployment. It was the decade of decadence and corporate takeovers that is so perfectly summed up in the famous words of Gordon Gekko in the film Wall Street: "Greed is good." Well, life was not good for the lower middle class. Crack was first seen on the streets around 1981, and by the mid-1980s, the drug was showing devastating effects on the lower income population. People were out of work. They were struggling to get by because of higher prices and more corporate greed, and some of them were on drugs. Mothers were working more, and that left kids home alone. Many of those kids had to fend for themselves, and unfortunately, many turned to gangs and sex work for money. And for some, once they were in that life, there was no way out. On August 19, 1985, Deborah Jackson, age 29, was found dead in the Vermont Slauson neighborhood of Los Angeles. Deborah was a cocktail waitress who had spent the evening with a friend in Linwood. She left that friend's house and went to take a bus to her home in South Central. Her body was found in an alleyway the next day. She had been shot 3 times. With the crime rate sky high and murder sadly a common event, Deborah's death was added to the list of unsolved cases, and it was assumed that she had just been shot after being robbed. Henrietta Wright, 34 years old, was murdered in Hyde Park about a year later. She had been shot twice, wrapped in a blanket, and had a cloth stuffed in her mouth. Again, this was seen as an individual murder, a sex worker in a high-risk profession who had been killed on the streets. Evidence was collected, and Henrietta's name was added to the long list of unsolved murders for the year in LA. Barbara Bethune Ware was found a few months later in January under a pile of trash in an alley. She too had been shot. Now, at this point, there were a couple of officers familiar with this life and with many of these girls who began to wonder. 3 victims with quite a few things in common, all shot and dumped in a similar manner. That was a little spooky, and there were officers who began to look at these cases in a different way, but they just weren't sure yet. They didn't have enough information to confidently classify the murders as linked. However, they decided to form a task force. They had some other missing girls and a few other murders that were just a little too similar, and they did begin to investigate those as though they might be linked. On April 15, 1987, Bernita Rochelle Sparks told her mother that she was going for cigarettes, and she never returned. She was found the next day in a trash bin covered in garbage. She had been beaten and shot as well. I had a difficult time finding details on exactly what type of DNA was being collected from each of the victims, but by 1987, they had enough biological material to have made a determination. Even with earlier DNA science, they were able to make some matches. There was some science to back their theory that these murders were linked. The police knew they were looking for a serial killer. The MO was similar in all of these murders. The victims were all black women who were working low-paying jobs, and most of them had used public transportation. Some of the police found it unusual that this killer was using a gun. In the 1980s, profiling was still a new concept, but most police knew enough about it to know that most serial killers prefer a more personal method of killing. Stabbing and strangling is more common. And yes, some of these victims had been strangled, but not all. They had all been shot. This, of course, only added to the unusual nature of this killer, as he used various methods to kill his victims. On top of the victims being similar in appearance and lifestyle, they were all found outside, and they had all been shot with a .25 caliber gun. From 1985 to 1987, police became more and more frustrated because they couldn't seem to put together much more than a very basic profile of this killer, but he was far from finished. Police had begun referring to this killer as the Strawberry Murderer. Strawberry is street slang for a woman who exchanges sex for drugs. The police went to the public for tips, but they never alerted the public to the fact that they believed the murders were linked, and they most definitely never used the words serial killer. There was a lot of criticism from the black community that not enough was being done about the murders. The police force at the time was overworked and understaffed, but there is some real validity to these complaints. The women who were being murdered were not wealthy. They were women of color, and the media simply did not give the public the sense of urgency required to draw attention to the killings. It really is awful, and I can imagine the anger at the time. Some of the residents were already living tough lives, scraping by, and now they've got a monster in their midst. It must have been really scary. The task force continued to work the case daily, but it seemed every time they got a lead, it led them right into a brick wall. They looked into hundreds of offenders and known criminals, people with similar proclivities to the killer they were hunting, but they could never find any information that linked them with this maniac who was stalking Los Angeles. They had no idea how many victims belonged to this single killer and no way of forming any type of list. Little did they know, the killer was making his own list. The flash and the sound of a Polaroid camera was perhaps one of the last sound that some of these women heard. The killer was making a morose documentary of his attacks and of his kills. The face of every woman he hurt and every woman he killed forever memorialized as he snapped their photo in their last moments of life. Ugh, I just kind of got a flash of what that would be like. You're laying there beaten and assaulted, and then somebody takes your picture, you know. Ugh. As authorities investigated and the mayor tried to placate the angry public, the killings continued. Mary Catherine Lowe was killed and dumped in Gramercy Park. She was last seen on Halloween night, 1987. She told her mother she was going to attend a party with some friends, and no one ever saw her again. Latrika Denise Jefferson was found about a year later in January of 1988. She too had been shot in the chest and dumped in an alleyway. Alicia Monique Alexander was found just a month later in Vermont Square. She told her father she was going to the liquor store and asked if he needed anything. She walked out the front door and was never seen alive again. Alicia was SA'd, and again she had been shot in the chest and dumped. As in the earlier murders, all of the women were shot with a .25 caliber gun, and all were found dumped in alleyways or by garbage bins outdoors. The police are growing more and more frustrated, and the pressure from area citizens is mounting. It starts to feel as if they're just waiting for the next body to be found, the next murder to take place. But then something different happens. Early in the morning on Sunday, November 20th, 1988, a woman burst through the doors of the emergency room at Harbor UCLA Medical Center. She has been shot and the bullet has collapsed one of her lungs. She's having a hard time breathing. Doctors rushed to try and save her life, and for a few days it looks like they might not be successful. But on the 5th day, a doctor is able to remove the bullet from her chest. He drops it into an evidence container and sends it off to the police laboratory. The woman, who is Anitra Margette Washington, survives. Anitra tells authorities that she doesn't know the man who shot her. She was walking along the street when a well-groomed black man drove up in a very nice car and asked if she wanted a ride. She said no, but then they traded a few playful insults and she decided to get in. She was impressed with the car. It was all white inside and the gear shift had been modified with the addition of a giant marble, a ball, for the handle. Anitra said she was headed to a party and she told the man he could come along. The man made a quick stop at a house in the neighborhood and then he got back in the car and for some reason he started speaking rudely to Anitra. She looked at him and said, "Who do you think you're talking to?" And then the man pulled a gun from the driver's side door and shot Anitra in the chest. She started to black out, but she was startled awake by the flash and the sound of a Polaroid camera. The man had taken a photograph of her as she was bleeding out. Anitra kind of came to her senses and the two began to fight. They struggled as the man drove through the streets. He then pulled over, beat Anitra with the gun, pushed her out of the car, and drove off. Anitra, shot, beaten, and wounded, then walked quite a distance to a friend's house and banged on the door for help. This was a tough gal, and she was not going down without a fight. And I find it interesting that because she fought back, he let her go. He could have easily shot her again and killed her, but he didn't. After Anitra survived, the police gathered as much information as they could from her. She gave them a solid description and even knew what the shooter's car looked like. But the police made what is now believed to be a crucial mistake. They did not tell the public that they had a serial killer working in the area. Had they done that, street cops and different precincts would have been aware that there was something very dangerous happened. They would have communicated with each other more clearly. But because this information was withheld, there were missed opportunities. They had an eyewitness who survived, but sadly, they never took advantage of the amazing witness they had in Anitra. She was never called in to look at lineups or photographs, and it is now believed that had she been utilized, she may have been able to assist with an identification. But something must have happened to the killer after Anitra got away. He may have been scared that he was about to be caught. He must have decided it was time to lay low, because the bodies stopped turning up for a very, very long time. But unfortunately, this maniac was not finished yet. He was just sleeping. And now, this is where I leave you. Stay tuned for the second half of this story coming to you from under the ash tree.
It would be nearly 14 years before Lonnie would terrorize Los Angeles once again. Or so it seemed. The murders appeared to have come to a halt, but that quickly changed on March 9, 2002. The body of 15-year-old Princess Bertha Mew was found naked and left in shrubbery in an alleyway in Inglewood. Princess grew up in foster care due to mistreatment from her parents. Princess was taken in by a great foster family where she became a daughter and a sister to them all. Sadly, when the mother passed away, Princess eventually had to move to another foster home where she was not well treated. She decided to run away from foster care, which forced her to live on the streets where she was recruited by a pimp. Princess's body was badly beaten. Her cause of death was strangulation. Princess wasn't shot unlike previous victims of Lonnie, so investigators weren't entirely sure if this was their guy. Then on July 11, 2003, another victim was discovered, 35-year-old Valerie McCorvey. She was found strangled with her clothes pulled down. Valerie was left at the entrance to a locked alleyway in Westmont, Los Angeles. Bodies turning up in the familiar hunting ground really threw up red flags for investigators, but the MO just didn't fit. Lonnie was convicted of a felony in 2003. He was sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation, which during this time, felons and people charged with certain crimes were required to submit a DNA sample due to the 2004 Proposition 69 being passed. While on probation, Lonnie's DNA was supposed to be entered into the database, but probation officers didn't collect on supervised probation between November 2004 to August 2005, since they did not have the resources. Due to this, Lonnie would continue to wreak havoc all over South Central LA. The last victim wouldn't be discovered until January 1, 2007. The body of Janika Peters, a 25-year-old mother, was found when a homeless man looking for cans discovered her nude body inside of a sealed trash bag in a garbage bin. Peters, unlike the previous two victims, was shot with a .25 caliber gun, the same gun used in the Southside Slayer cases. Thinking this was merely coincidence, DNA recovered at the Peters case was compared to previous victims, and it was a match. The Southside Slayer was back, and they weren't planning to let him fall through their grasp this time around. In 2007, Bill Bratton, the police commissioner, finally set up a task force in secrecy to help solve the crime. However, 4 months after the task force was put in place, Christine Pelisek, a journalist for the LA Weekly, wrote a piece not only confirming the existence of the task force, but also notifying the public that Peters' murder was linked to 10 others dating back to 1985. The piece was important, informing the families of the victims that their loved ones were victims of a serial killer. Christine included in her report that the police weren't interested in the murders because they occurred in poor areas and the victims were all Black women. Bratton received criticism for the way he handled the case, especially since he didn't hold any press conferences to notify the public of a potential serial killer. However, his task force was still moving forward despite all the revelations. In September 2008, LA officials announced a $500,000 reward to anyone who may know anything to help catch the killer. They even pushed for the case to be featured on America's Most Wanted in November of the same year, hoping for any leads, but they only received dead ends. On February 25, 2009, Police Commissioner Bratton addressed the press for the first time regarding the Peters case. He confirmed the possibility of a serial killer operating in LA being the same killer from 14 years before, officially calling him the Grim Sleeper, a moniker given by the LA Weekly. The following month after word was officially out, Christine with LA Weekly conducted an extensive interview with Anitra Washington to once again get the details about her attacker out in the public eye. This included his appearance and his vehicle. But unlike in the 80s, technology had significantly advanced. The DNA recovered from the Peters case was entered into the state felon database, where they got a hit. They received a familial match to one Christopher Franklin. Christopher Franklin was entered into the database in 2008 after being arrested on a felony weapons charge. But since Christopher was too young to have committed earlier murders, they shifted their focus to his father, Lonnie Franklin Jr. Lonnie had a criminal history, but nothing as extensive as murder. Before attempting to arrest him, and concerned with privacy violations and ensuring the results were correct, they spent an additional 2 weeks retesting the results and going through the next legal steps. But the DNA was a match every time, and LAPD officials realized the grave nature of this news. Information regarding the DNA results was kept tight, and they worked hard to ensure it wasn't leaked out. Within hours of meeting, undercover surveillance officers were put in charge of following Lonnie around the clock. They had a total of 14 to 16 member teams from special investigations and narcotics watching his every move. Lonnie didn't do much. He stayed mostly indoors other than running a few errands, nothing that would allow for a DNA collection. He was, however, more active at night, taking long, pointless drives, but he never did anything they could arrest him on. They finally got a break when on Monday, July 5, 2010, Franklin decided to stop for pizza near Buena Park. After Franklin finished eating, one of the investigators posing as a busboy cleared his table, collecting a fork, 2 cups, napkins, and a partially eaten slice of pizza. The items were taken to the LAPD's DNA lab where analysis worked quickly. By 7 a.m. on Wednesday, July 7th, they had the results. The DNA from the pizza matched the DNA found at the crime scenes. That same day at 9:20 a.m., Lonnie Franklin Jr. was arrested at his home, a location described as being right in the heart of all of the murders. Police searched his property for a total of 3 days, where they discovered numerous pieces of women's jewelry and an FIE Titan .25 caliber semi-automatic handgun hidden away in a room. It was later determined the weapon found was the same one used in the murder of Janika Peters. In his garage, they discovered the school ID card for 18-year-old Aaliyah Marshall and a Nevada ID card for 29-year-old Rolenia Morris, both of which who were last seen in the vicinity of Franklin's home at 81st and Western Avenue. Neither of them have ever been located. Inside of his home, investigators found many photos of unidentified women. The images showed mostly black women who ranged in age from teenage to middle age and older. Many of the victims were nude, some beaten and bleeding, and some even appearing to be unconscious or possibly deceased. Photos of the Grim Sleeper's 10 known victims were discovered within the collection, including one of Anitra Washington. The number of photos recovered led authorities to believe that the Grim Sleeper may not have been sleeping. They believed he could be responsible for a much greater number of South Central LA's unsolved murders than originally thought. The LAPD eventually released 180 of the photos from his home. They hoped in doing so that they could have the public's assistance in identifying the victims that remained unnamed. Since the release, detectives identified at least 20 more of these women. Police also believed Lonnie was responsible for at least 6 more deaths, stating they were able to link him through reviewing old case files, but unfortunately they did not have the evidence to prove he was responsible. They also considered him a suspect in the murder of 36-year-old Thomas Steele. Thomas's body was discovered in August of 1986, but there was no DNA present at the scene, so he could not be charged. Thomas is considered the unofficial 11th victim of the Grim Sleeper. Franklin's trial started in February 2016 after several delays and lasted for 3 months. Every day was long and emotional, filled with testimony, including some from the victims' families. The defense requested the court to limit the number of victim impact witnesses who could be called by the prosecution, but this motion was denied by the judge. Anitra was finally able to face the man who assaulted her. She said to him, quote, "You're truly a piece of evil. You're a Satan representative. You're right up there with Manson," end quote. Prosecution stated Franklin's crimes were all about power and control, describing him as a predator who killed women who weren't submissive enough. It was clear to them he got pleasure from taking lives and wanted to degrade them by any means, which included dumping their bodies like trash. The defense attempted to throw out the DNA evidence retrieved, explaining it was controversial. Franklin's lawyer cited the evidence was an invasion of privacy and it should be thrown out. However, the claim of discarded food being considered private was overruled by the court, and the DNA evidence was allowed to stay. The defense argued that an unknown assailant could have been responsible for the 10 killings for which Lonnie was being prosecuted. However, there was no evidence to support this theory, with the defense stating the only DNA profile that repeats itself again and again is the defendant's. The trial concluded on May 5, 2016, where the jury, after 1.5 days of deliberation, found Lonnie guilty of 10 counts of murder and 1 count of attempted murder, which occurred between 1985 to 1988 and 2002 to 2007. He was sentenced to death for his crimes on August 10, 2016. He arrived to death row in San Quentin State Prison on August 16, 2016. But Lonnie would only serve 4 years of his sentence before he was found dead on March 28, 2020 at the age of 67. San Quentin corrections officers discovered him unresponsive in his cell with no signs of trauma. The news of his death came as a sense of relief for the grieving families, with the stepmother of one victim, Barbara Ware, commenting, quote, "I won't say I'm pleased, he died, but at the end there was justice for all the bad things he did in his life. We can now be at peace," end quote. Unfortunately, no one knows exactly how many lives Lonnie took, since he died before revealing any further victims.
Hello friends, thank you for taking time out of your week to spend a little with us. We greatly appreciate you. As always, we're interested in hearing your thoughts, so comment below and we can chat about this case. If you found this to be informative, please consider giving the video a thumbs up, and if you're not subscribed yet, you should, because we would love to have you join us. I want to give a big thank you to Dining with Death for inviting me to come on this video and help share this with you all. I hope you all enjoyed the video, and who knows, maybe we can do it again sometime in the future. But until then, stay safe, friends, and we will see you in the next one. Bye!